Welcome back to week 2 of Daniel. Last week we looked at the historical setting of Daniel and the main theme of God's sovereignty that runs throughout both the historical and the apocalyptic sections of the text. This theme might seem odd as we are presented with the Israelite nation, God's people, being sent into exile into a nation that neither worships or cares about the one true God. But even in these circumstances, or any circumstances, either God-led, self-induced, imposed by others, or a result of a fallen world that sees sickness and death, God is with us in those circumstances. What we get a glimpse of this week is the choice to place faith and identity in God at all times through the example of a few of these exiled Israelites. Babylon had carried off the young, physical and intellectually capable royal or noble Israelite men to be trained to serve in the Babylonian court. We will pick up from halfway through verse 4. He, that was the court official, was to teach them the languages and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. These exiles have just witnessed the plundering of their hometown. They have been unceremoniously taken from their homes where they had title and influence and thrust into another culture, another country, where they were expected to be trained to serve the very ones who conquered the land. There was a well-conceived method by how the Babylonians achieved this end of exile royal servants: a cultural detox, a rewiring from a formative age. For 3 years, these young men, roughly around 14 to 16 years old, lived and breathed and ate Babylon. The stories of their Israelite histories that were so steeped in covenant relationship, Israel, which had a relationship with God, were now replaced with Babylonian literature and philosophies, their teachings, their beliefs, which included their gods. They were supplied with the comforts of Babylon. They were eating and drinking the finest of foods directly from the king's table himself. It would have been delicious, and possibly made the transition seem not so bad. And the officials changed their name. Names form a part of our identity, and in the case of Daniel and his friends, their name also bore a truth about God. Daniel translates, God is my judge. Hananiah is, the Lord is gracious. Mishael, who is like Elohim, another word for God. And Azariah, the Lord helps. Their names honored God and would have been a reminder of the God of their fathers if they were to use them. Their names had to go, along with their identity, to make room for their new identity in their new life, in their new country. This wasn't just about learning about another nation. It was the act of assimilation, the Israelites into the nation, so that the way they thought, they behaved, ate and believed, was from a Babylonian perspective. A cultural adjustment, enough that there was a dependency and acceptance of Babylonian life. We continue reading from verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." He agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Daniel resolved. He made up his mind. Daniel was both respectful and cheeky, or determined, in his decision. He first asked the court official, who didn't say yes, but didn't really say no either, just that he was afraid that they would look poorly and the king would take his head off for that. This illustrates the stakes that are involved even in the request. If the king had taken offense to the request, it is his food after all. He could have had those involved killed. If it looked like the young men were not well nourished, he could have those involved killed. This request required a level of boldness. The second time Daniel asks for the food modification, it is to the guard who directly is looking after the boys. And he presents a test with the food he would eat, the time frame in which the test is to be performed, and the parameters by which success would be measured. Veg and water, 10 days, compare us to the others. But why food? What about the royal food and wine would be considered defiling? There's a couple of real possibilities. First, under Jewish law, there were certain foods that were considered unclean, and to eat them were to defile yourself, as covered in Leviticus chapter 11. This would have included crustacean, meat from pigs, and some birds. These were not restricted foods for the Babylonians. Second, whether all the time or even just some of the time, the food would have comprised of food that was brought to the temples of the foreign gods to worship them, then to the king's table. Daniel would not have wanted to take part of idol worship and would have regarded eating the food as engaging in the practice. Daniel was being indoctrinated into the Babylonian world. He learnt their culture, he learnt their history, he had a Babylonian name, and he would later work for the king of Babylon. But from the start, Daniel seemed to have a grasp on which battle to fight, on what he was determined to let define him, to sink into his identity. And while he was a part of Babylon, it was not Babylon that sustained him, but the God of Israel. And every time he and his companions ate, they would have been reminded of that fact. There was perseverance and risk in the request, and a heart that sought to worship God as the one true God in all situations. While Daniel might have driven the request, it impacted the lives of not just himself, but also those of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and was a witness to the guard who cared for the group. Not sure if the other 3 were willing participants or just got caught up in the ride, but this one step of faith would grow in God, and they would stand against adversity later in their lives. It was the early decision that helped form convictions about who they were and who was their God. This allowed them to be flexible in location, discerning in information, and solid in faith. For their faith was not determined by external pressure or circumstances, but a decision that God was sovereign over their life. The decision to put God first in their lives wasn't always easy, and resulted in Daniel spending a night with the lions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah taking a walk in a ridiculously hot furnace. In these moments, they had resolved, whether in life or death, God alone was worthy of their worship. The food switch would see the young men healthier than the other exiles, and God gifted them with knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Further still, at the end of the 3 years, when they were presented and tested before Nebuchadnezzar himself, the king of Babylon, he found the 4 to be top of the class by a clear margin. Not only top of the class, but the best in the whole kingdom. And their reward? They entered the king's service, the very thing they were being trained to do. Their gifts they received gifted them to serve the conquering nation, Babylon, exceptionally well. Daniel was even gifted with interpreting dreams and visions, a valuable commodity in the Babylonian Empire. Yet the source of his gift was vastly different to that of the magicians and enchanters, and would later allow him a platform to speak into the king's life. At so many points of their lives, the 4 Israelites could have chosen to perceive their situation differently, that God had abandoned them, that they needed to rebel against Babylon, that it was everyone else's fault. Yet they chose to see God as sovereign, God who was with them in their situation, and God who could do something with them even while serving in a foreign land. This might be easy to say, but it is hard to live out day to day. It requires determination and perseverance to check our thoughts and motives, to take the step of faith, whether that be great or small, to make a choice, to recognize it is God who sustains us, God who is with us, and figure out what that means to us in our lives. As we take steps in faith, faith grows. As we discuss this chapter in our groups and what this might look like in our own lives, don't forget we also have the gift of the Holy Spirit to guide us and to strengthen us where we feel the weakest. Just as Daniel and his companions were not left to their own devices, we also are not left alone. I'll leave you to have these discussions with your group, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.